Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the beginnings of World War One. World War One is really what shapes society today. To really understand the modern world, you have to understand World War One. And you look at like if on the far right of the map, you'll see the Ottoman Empire that doesn't exist anymore. You'll see Russia on the right, which after during the war we had the Russian Revolution, which now they've now like a communist state, and this puts us on the path toward the Cold War. The Middle East is completely redrawn because of the World War One. So to truly understand the world today, you really have to look at World War One. Now, before this, we'd like to talk about America being isolationist, not wanting to get in entanglements in Europe because that was a mandate from George Washington. But really, we had already been on the path toward this. As we extended our borders and occupied more land, especially after the Spanish-American War. But we were trying to keep it limited in scope, but we're drawn into the world stage with World War One. Now, World War One is honestly one of the most confusing wars to understand. It because there's just so much going on. What you can picture World War One like is something like you have someone you really don't like, and that person, he or she, keeps doing things to annoy you, make you angrier and angrier, to the point where you get to that point where just one more time, just one more thing, say one more thing, and I'll hit you, and that's World War One. And all these things that are brewing underneath are this concept that's pretty much linked to imperialism. As these imperial powers are spreading their borders, they're smacking up against each other. And so a couple of things start to happen. They see, like, if they're smacking up against each other, that's my opponent, some sort of enemy. So we need to protect ourselves. So we start to build more and more, tanks, more and more warships. So we increase our armies. And if your neighbor's buying a bunch of weapons, and and maybe even setting up weapons and protections around his wall, around his house or something, you're going to start to wonder what he's up to, and you're going to start to feel threatened, and then you're going to want to build up more stuff. And this goes back and forth, and as militaries build up, so does suspicion. And because of the suspicion, a lot of countries secretly reach out to other countries to say, hey, if so and so hits me, will you back me up? Will you jump in with me? And they start creating these secret alliances. Another thing brewing in this is these empires are growing. They're occupying and taking land that now it's no longer just like Germany, but they spread their borders into other areas. So there's no more than just Germans living in those areas. And you start to see these ethnic groups wanting their land back, wanting their identity back. And this becomes extreme forms of nationalism that are pushing within the borders of these empires. And all this is brewing all at once. And then one event lights the fire. But it was going to happen one way or the other, and this is what lights the fire. And that's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Austrian Empire had spread into Serbia. And the Serbians wanted their own country, and they wanted their country back. And we're not Austrian, we're more Russian, and we want if we're going to ally with anyone or be occupied with anyone, we'd rather it be the Russians. So this inside the country, there was a group of inside of Serbia, where there were a group of nationalists that were like, we need to get the Austrians out of here. And it was a small knit group, but they wanted to do something about it. And then they heard that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was going to tour Serbia. And they saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike at Austria. So they learned where the route he's going to be traveling in with his motorcade, and they decided to station assassins in different parts of it. And so as he's driving by, a bomb gets set off, and it immobilizes his car, but it really doesn't hurt him. So he gets another vehicle, and he goes in a very different direction, thinking, well, they know where I'm going. Meanwhile, one of the assassins is waiting down the road, waiting, and he never shows up. So he gets hungry, and decides to go down the road to the sandwich shop he had heard good things about. And lo and behold, who crosses his path but the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and he opens fire, killing him and his wife. And that's why a lot of some historians will tell you that World War One became happened because of a sandwich. So what ends up happening is the alliance system is triggered. And though you're like this little guy here at the beginning of it, this little line of people hitting each other, the one at the very end probably has no clue what he's doing other than I'm going to just jump in and help fight. But what started the fight or what's going on, they don't have a clue. And so basically what this turns into is like a big, like we would call like a bar fight that you see in the movie. Two guys are fighting, and then one of them bumps into another one, and they start jumping in, their friends start jumping in, and then soon the whole bar is fighting, and probably the last ones didn't know what the heck was going on. So in a sense, the way it kind of plays itself out is Austria invades Serbia. Serbia calls for his big brother Russia to come in, and then Russia comes into the war, and then Serbia's alliance with Germany gets triggered, and then soon comes England, soon comes France, and then the whole world gets drawn into this war. So when you look at the alliances, you're going to see Great Britain, France, Russia, eventually United States. And then you have the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire is probably is one of the oldest empires at this point. They've been around since before Columbus. When we look at the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire. And when all these guys get dragged in, it becomes this world conflict. And like I said, the people at the beginning probably knew what was going on, but toward the end, these soldiers had no clue other than they were being drafted to fight a war for their empire. Now, World War One is a distinct and different type of war than had ever been fought in a large scale in the world. Now, we are looking at a war that happens after the Industrial Revolution. We're looking at guys going to war whose probably grandfathers or fathers were knights and using armor and all this. They were not too far from that. And so their concept of war was very different than the reality of war. Because of the Industrial Revolution, not only we make machines to help produce more shirts or whatever, we made machines to kill. So you had tanks used in war. Now, another thing that you need to think about is this, these guys maybe have been fighting wars, but in like places like Latin America and in places like in Africa and places where people weren't as equipped as them. So we see the use of tanks, use of submarines to attack shipping. We see the use of poison gas. And we see the use of aircraft. Starts with the Zeppelins, which for surveillance, and then you have the aircraft you see there at the top. Some of these planes start off just as like surveillance planes. Then someone gets the idea, I could drop a bomb from here. So they start dropping bombs from there. So then the other side's like, we got to stop them from dropping bombs. So they create fighter aircraft to shoot down their aircraft, and then soon you have like dogfights and in the air trying to protect the ground. And a large-scale use of machine guns. And this really turned the World War I into something that hadn't been seen before in such a large scale. Because of the use of machine guns, you start to see the growing use of trenches. Trenches start pretty much as a foxhole. A foxhole is like when someone's shooting at you, you're in open ground and you're trying to find some place to hide, you dig a hole and get in it. And these holes became longer and longer and longer, and in time you had thousands of miles of trenches. And the reason this happens is, like I mentioned earlier, they had never really fought a war with an opponent that was as well equipped as them. So they're like equally matched. So when they smack in together, neither side can push one way or the other way, and they just kind of become static and stay still and dig in where they are. And World War I just becomes a war of inches, a war of feet. And these trench lines, you have one trench line your enemy, the other trench line your trench line, and then in between the trench line is something we call no man's land, because you don't want to be caught out in it. Because they would just lay down machine gun fire all across no man's land. And then there's the whole futility of war, because the only way to get to the other side is to charge it. But what happens when you charge? You pretty much are getting massacred. Your numbers are getting decimated. So every day they imagine being forced to run up over the trenches, into certain death. And then the next day, the same thing over and over for years. And this is why you get battles with over 1 million casualties, like the Battle of Somme and Verdun. And the soldiers literally look at it like, you guys are idiots. How can you, this is stupid. And they start to really question their leadership. And then they start to question, why the heck am I even here? And like, what am I fighting for? I don't even know what this war is all about. And a lot of these people are conscripts. They're drafted. And they're there just wondering, and the saddest part is these guys in one trench and then their enemies in that trench are thinking the exact same thing. They actually have more in common with each other than they do with their commanders.